Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a Diablo 3 patch 2.5 season 10 video on the best builds. We're going to take a look at the 10 best builds that you can play for solo Greater Rift pushing in season 10. And we're also going to do something that we haven't done before, which is group these builds into a tier list. It may be a bit unusual to create a tier list for a game like Diablo, but it'll better help visualize the respective strengths of the builds. In our tier list, we're just going to classify these builds into a few different tiers, and every tier is stronger than the tier below it. So we're going to start all the way at the bottom with our honorable mentions. As in, they should be honored that we're mentioning them at all. So we start in the F tier, as in, F these builds. These are the worst of the best. I'll need to stress here that none of the builds that we're going to go over are bad builds. Every one of you can realistically clear a Greater Rift 70 and higher with any build that we're going to cover in this video. And top players have cleared at least Greater Rift 90s with every single build that we're covering. But all the builds in the F tier are all about 15 Greater Rift levels behind our top tier. And we're going to start with the Uliana Monk. Uliana's can be a strong build. It particularly requires the abuse of certain snapshot mechanics, which is a little bit gimmicky, but it's just no longer competitive with other monk builds. If you have no other monk set, then sure, run with an Uliana build. It will be strong, but literally any other monk set will serve you better. Sunmuko, Inna, or Raymond. Speaking of, that takes us to our next honorable mention, the Sunmuko Lashing Tailkick Monk. This is a poor man's version of the Legacy of Nightmares Lashing Tailkick Monk build. And it's a serviceable alternative to help you build up the gear pieces to your Legacy of Nightmares LTK, since a lot of the gear is transferable between the builds. There are also other Sunmuko builds, such as a Wave of Light build, that are really good for speedruns, so Sunmuko's isn't a terrible set. It just gets outclassed by some other monk builds for top and Greater Rift clears. Our next honorable mention is the Legacy of Nightmares Thorns Barbarian. Legacy of Nightmares builds are the most difficult to gear for. You need to get those Ancients, you need to get the right Ancients, and you need to get the right stats on those Ancients. And when a Legacy of Nightmare build is not considerably more powerful than an alternative non-Legacy of Nightmare build, then it's just not worth that extra effort. In the case of the Legacy of Nightmares Barbarian, there are more powerful Barbarian builds that are easier to gear for. And while this build isn't significantly less powerful than the other Barbarian builds that we'll go over, the fact that it's so difficult to gear for lands it squarely in the F tier. Only use this build if you really like the playstyle. And on to our last F tier build, we have the Zunimaza Witch Doctor. Zunimaza's is getting a considerable buff in patch 2.5, which is what allows it to place on this tier list at all. But that damage buff alone is not enough to fix Zuni's. Toughness and usability issues keep this build in the F tier. And the best Zuni build that I've seen experimented with on the public tests realm is basically just a poor man Helltooth's Gargantuan build. So why run the Zuni version when the Helltooth version is better? Well, I'll tell you why. Because Zuni's is the starter set for Season 10 for the Witch Doctor. And for a starter set, it's really strong. Perhaps the strongest starter set. It's for that reason that I'm actually going Witch Doctor on one of the two servers that I play on. You'll use Zuni's to build towards your endgame build. And it'll do a great job at helping you achieve that. But Zuni's won't be your endgame build. We'll have a video coming up soon on a starter Zunimaza's build to help you kick off your season as a Witch Doctor. That takes us to the D tier. D as in, don't use these builds, unless there isn't a better build for your class. Sorry, barbarians. Seriously though, if you enjoy the playstyle of these builds, they're definitely viable builds, and top players have cleared around Greater Rift 100 with them. D tier is roughly 12 Greater Rift levels behind the top tier. We've got a couple more honorable mentions to get through in this tier before we dive into the top 10, and we're starting with the Invoker Thorns Crusader. Invoker Thorns isn't a terrible build, and it can serve as a step towards building up a Legacy of Nightmares Thorns Crusader. However, it's simply been outclassed by the top Crusader builds, which lands it in the D tier. Next, we have the Roland's Crusader. Roland's received a big buff in patch 2.5, allowing for something of a revival of an old build that was the best Crusader build in the past, back when permanent crowd control was possible. Now the build has been resurrected into possible viability through a huge damage boost, but Roland's really suffers from usability issues, regardless of how much damage it does. Hypothetically, in 2.5, Roland's is about on par with Invokers, maybe a little better. On the test server, I've seen it clear a Greater Rift 95. Again though, Crusader has some really strong builds, and this just doesn't compete. Our final honorable mention, the Leapquake Barbarian. This build was F tier prior to patch 2.5, but 2.5 buffed this build, landing it in the D tier and maybe just 1 to 2 Greater Rift levels behind the best Barbarian builds, which are all D tier as well. We have a build guide for the Leapquake Barbarian for patch 2.5 where we go over the changes and what got buffed. Alright, still in the D tier, but on to number 10, we have a 3-way tie starting with the Jade Witch Doctor. The Jade Doc has fallen by the wayside over the past several patches, outclassed first by Helltooth pet builds, then Rhykker builds as well. The buff a couple patches ago to Greater Rift Density served as an indirect buff to the Jade Doctor build, but this went largely unnoticed because it still isn't as powerful as Firebats. Jade isn't the worst Witch Doctor set, but it's certainly not the best. Also tied for 10th place, we have the Charge Barbarian. The Charge Barb, combining Rhykkers and Immortal Kings, has been one of the best Barbarian builds for a very long time, and it still retains its place. It used to be the best Barbarian build, up until the density changes to Greater Rifts allowed for the reemergence of the Whirlwind Barb, which we'll get to soon. Our final build, tied for 10th place, is the Helltooth Gargantuan. The Helltooth Gargantuan build was the best Witch Doctor build a few patches ago before a new build emerged. A new build was discovered that was a lot more glass cannon. Since then, power creep and density changes have led to other builds emerging and pushing the Helltooth Gargantuan down the list of best builds, with somewhat frustrating pet AI being perhaps this build's greatest problem. That said, it's still a very powerful build that has been taken to over Greater Rift 100. And lastly, in the D tier, coming in at number 9, we have the Whirlwind Barbarian. This is the final Barbarian build that we'll cover on this list, and it certainly says something about the state of Barbarians when they can't rise above the D tier or 9th place. They have unquestionably lower Greater Rift clears than any other class. However, there is a silver lining here. The Barbarian has 3 builds that are just about equally viable, which actually makes it one of the best internally balanced classes. Barbarian builds may not be balanced relative to other classes, but relative to other Barbarian builds, things are looking pretty good. Next, we move into the C tier builds. C as in, could be better. These are your average builds. Average of the best. These builds are like that student that always got good grades. Never great grades, but he passed all his courses. He did very well. He's a smart guy. You meet up with him 10 years later at your reunion and you find out he's got a wife and kids and nice little house, and he's doing pretty well for himself. These builds are about 10 Greater Rift levels behind the top tier builds. And all 5 of the builds in this tier are tied for 8th place. This is a very tight grouping in power level. We start with the Inna's Explosive Palm Monk. The Inna set was buffed in patch 2.5 and now deals 25% more damage than it used to. Prior to this buff, I would have placed Inna's EP in the D tier, but this buff should, hypothetically, bring it up a couple Greater Rift levels and land it in the C tier. There are a couple great things about the Inna set. First off, it's the Monk's Season 10 starting set. Second, there are a couple of viable Monk builds that use the Inna set. And third, if you want to build a support monk, which is always wanted and adored in a group, then you'll also need Innas. It's for these reasons that when I play on the European server this season, I'll be going monk. We also have a build guide on the Inna's Exploding Palm Monk if you want to check that out. The next build tied for 8th place, we have the Legacy of Nightmares Lashing Tailkick Monk. While a powerful build, this Legacy of Nightmares build remains average because there are more powerful monk builds that are easier to gear for. That said, from here on out for monks, it's only generator builds. So if you prefer this playstyle, it's definitely a solid build. Next, we have the Marauders Grenades build for the Demon Hunter. The emergence of Grenades builds in the previous season, combined with a buff to the Marauders set, saw a Marauders Grenades build emerge as a top build, and it continues to hold its own. It's only about 2 Greater Rift levels behind the current best Demon Hunter builds. But the best thing about this build is that the Marauder set is the Demon Hunter starter set for Season 10, and we've got a video explaining this build. Next up, we have the Demon Hunter Shadow Impale build. The 2.5 buffs to the Shadow Impale build allows it to basically deal triple the damage that it used to deal, allowing it to actually earn a spot on this list. Hypothetically, it'll be a couple Greater Rift levels behind the top Demon Hunter builds. But most importantly, this build could potentially be used in group play, serving a role as an Elite and Rift Guardian killer. A big problem with many Demon Hunter builds is that their playstyles are generally not conducive for the synergy of an optimized Greater Rift pushing party. But this build has the mobility and toughness to skip through monsters and stick with a group. And the last build in our C tier is the Firebat's Witch Doctor, both the Rhykker and the Helltooth variants. For solo pushing, the Firebat's build is the best Witch Doctor build. The Helltooth version has more toughness, and the Rhykker version has more damage, but again, they're equally viable. For group pushing, you'll want to use the Rhykker variant, since you can rely on your team to keep you alive. Firebat's is perhaps the game's best build at dealing with large groups of enemies. Alright, this takes us to the B tier. B as in better than any other build we've gone over, but still not the best. Starting with our two-way tie for number 7, we have the Legacy of Nightmares Fan of Knives build. This was a top Demon Hunter build for a long time, but it was dethroned last patch when Grenades builds emerged. It remains a powerful build, but Legacy of Nightmares, so it is difficult to gear for, and it really isn't the most enjoyable of playstyles. You may wonder why I never made a guide to this build. It's because I hate it. I just hate it. I can't stand it. Also tied for 7th place is the Inna Generator build. Since last season, this build has emerged as an alternative to the Raiment Generator build. It's easier to play, it's less glass cannon, but it only did half the damage of the Raiment version, meaning it cleared 5 Greater Rift levels lower. Now, thanks to the 2.5 buffs to Innas, it deals 25% more damage, so it's only about 2-3 at most Greater Rift levels behind Raiment Generator. In theory. And if you want to check out this build, we have a guide on it right here. And our last B tier build, coming in at number 6, is the Unhallowed Essence Grenades Demon Hunter. This is the best Demon Hunter build. Arising in Season 9, this build basically remains unchanged, and there's not much more to say. Unhallowed Essence was always an excellent speed rifting build, and ever since the emergence of this Grenades variant, it's also excellent for Greater Rift pushing. We also have a video going over this build. Okay, on to our A tier list builds. A tier as in, these builds are A-okay. These would be considered the best builds, if not for another tier that is borderline overpowered. These builds are about 5 Greater Rift levels behind the absolute top tier builds. So coming in at number 5, we have the Legacy of Nightmares Bombardment Crusader. This is the Thorns Crusader build that was the top build for a while, and it remains the second best Crusader build. However, being a Legacy of Nightmares build, it's difficult to gear for, making the current top Crusader build that has usurped it an easy pick. Our old build guide is still mostly applicable for the Lawn Bomb Crusader. Number 4, the Raiment Duo Generator Monk build. This is the best monk build. Raiment Generator has been a top monk build for a while, but it's a little bit more recently that the Duo Generator version of the build emerged as slightly more powerful. Yes, we did see some Duo Generator back in Season 4, but it fell out of favor and only re-emerged more recently. It's the same basic build, but it just works in a second generator, specifically Way of the 100 Fists, and it uses the damage buff of its Assimilation rune. It's only marginally more powerful than the non-duo generator variant, but given it's been the best build for seasons, it's all about little optimizations. On to our final build in the A tier, coming in at number 3, we have the Firebird Archon Wizard. The Firebird Wizard reigned supreme for far too long, and when a new build emerged as a viable alternative, Wizard players were quick to flock to it. But the Firebird Wizard is no less powerful than it used to be. Wizards are in a place where they basically have the least amount of build diversity, but they do have the most powerful builds. Alright, on to our final tier, the S tier. S as in, surely these are the best builds in the game. Coming in at number 2, we have the Hammerden Crusader. This is the best Crusader build. The Hammerden has been a top build for a little while, but when it was first emerging, when it first got buffed, I thought that it would still be surpassed by the Legacy of Nightmares Bombardment Crusader. But it seems that this glass cannon Crusader build does end up dealing more damage. Our Season 9 build guide on the Hammerden is still applicable for Season 10. And lastly, coming in at number 1, we have the Lightning Wizard. This is the best wizard build and the best solo build in the game. Now, patch 2.5 sees a slight nerf to the standard Archon Lightning Wizard build, dropping it by around 1 Great Rift level, but it also introduces the Hydra variant, which will basically make up for that slight nerf. We have a build guide on the Hydra Lightning Archon Wizard right here. And that concludes this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Which build do you want to run in Season 10? Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch and Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more Diablo guides.